My name was Allison Gray. I was 41 years old, a literature teacher who baked apple pies on Sundays. I knew how to explain Shakespeare to teenagers and pair wine with salmon. And then I found myself in a maximum security women's prison. In the first week, they broke one of my ribs. In the second, they took my name. To survive, I learned the most important rule: forget who you were, or die. I survived. But when I was released, I realized I was no longer Allison, and the woman I had become. There was no turning her back. If this story resonated with your soul, click subscribe and let me know in the comments which city or country you're listening from. I'm truly curious to know where you're tuning in from. My name was Allison Gray. I was 41 years old, and I had once been a literature professor at a small liberal arts college in Connecticut. I taught Shakespeare and Steinbeck. I had a favorite pen. I drank Darjeeling tea at exactly 4 o'clock. I could quote Emily Dickinson by heart and make my students fall in love with poetry like it was a new language. But none of that mattered now. That morning, I sat on the edge of a plastic bench inside the county holding facility, wearing a pale lavender dress that I had chosen carefully. Soft, feminine, not too bright, not too bold. A dress that said, "I'm still human." A dress that had once hung in my closet next to tailored slacks and silk scarves, back when my life had symmetry and silence and control. My hands trembled in my lap, fingers laced together so tightly the knuckles turned white. I still had my wedding ring on, though the marriage had collapsed years ago. I kept it because it made people less suspicious, because it made me feel like I had once belonged to someone, to something. They called my name like it didn't belong to me anymore. Gray, Allison. 2 syllables shaved down to gravel in the deputy's mouth. I stood, my knees wobbled. The heels I wore, low and practical, no longer made sense on the cement floor. The sound of them clicking against it felt obscene, wrong. The officer who escorted me didn't look at me. He simply gestured forward, toward a narrow corridor that smelled of bleach and sweat and something older, like time left to rot. We walked past other women, some in cuffs, some slumped in chairs, some with their eyes fixed on me like they already knew what I didn't. Their eyes weren't cruel. They weren't kind either. They were flat, like mirrors in a room without light. When we reached the intake door, he knocked twice and pushed it open. The room was too bright. Fluorescent lights buzzed above like insects trapped behind glass. A plastic chair sat in the center of the floor, a table with a clipboard. A uniformed woman with a face so expressionless it might have been carved from stone told me to step forward. I did. She told me to remove my dress. I paused, not in defiance, just in disbelief, as if I hadn't understood the language. She repeated herself, louder. I reached behind my neck and found the zipper with fingers that no longer obeyed me. The fabric peeled away from my shoulders, slow and reluctant, sliding down my arms. I stood in my bra and underwear, the kind you wear when you expect to be home by evening. No lace, no color, just cotton and familiarity. She took the dress from my hands and folded it without ceremony. Then she opened a drawer and pulled out an orange jumpsuit, stiff with starch and time. She handed it to me like an afterthought. I stared at it. There was no mirror in the room, but I didn't need one. I could feel the change happening as I stepped into that shapeless thing. It swallowed me, erased me. My skin burned with the knowledge that I no longer belonged to myself. The wedding ring was taken next, then the shoes, my watch, my earrings. Everything that had once said, "I am me," disappeared into a gray plastic bin with a number scrawled across the lid. Not my name, not my profession, just a number. I sat again, this time smaller, folded inward. They took my photo. I didn't smile. They fingerprinted me. The ink was cold. They gave me a pair of socks and a rough towel, and then I was led through another door. This one buzzed open, like the sound that marks the end of a game show round. Behind it, the world changed. The hallway on the other side was silent except for the low shuffle of feet and the occasional bark of orders. The air was heavier here, not just with scent, but with something thicker, like the breath of too many people forced to inhale the same despair. I walked with my eyes forward, afraid to look, afraid to be seen. Inmates passed me, their expressions unreadable. Some were younger than me, some older. All of them watched with that same flatness, that same slow calculation. I could feel the verdict forming before I ever spoke a word. When we reached my assigned unit, the door closed behind me with the sound of finality. The kind of sound you don't forget. A sound that stamps itself into your bones. I was shown to a bunk, bottom, near the back wall. The mattress was thin, the pillow thinner. A folded blanket lay at the edge. No sheets, no comfort. The woman in the top bunk didn't speak. She glanced down once, then rolled over. I sat, my knees together, my hands clenched in my lap. My dress, the one I had worn to remind myself who I was now a memory packed into a bin somewhere behind a locked door. That night I lay awake and tried to recite sonnets in my head. I tried to remember lines of poetry, the cadence of stanzas, the soft rise and fall of metaphors, but nothing came, just the hum of the lights, the murmur of breath from the beds around me, and the slow pulsing realization that I had been erased. In that moment, I understood the truth no one tells you about incarceration. It's not the bars that break you, it's the stillness, the way time presses in, silent and heavy, until you forget how to speak in your own voice. I stared at the ceiling until my eyes burned. The dress was gone, and with it, everything I had once believed about myself. Her name was Lita. I heard it for the first time whispered across a meal tray, the kind of whisper that didn't carry fear, but reverence, like the name of a ghost who still wandered the corridors. She didn't look like much at first. Thin, hard angles, cropped hair like it had been hacked off with dull scissors, a tattoo of a broken crown on the back of her neck. She moved quietly, deliberately, like a shadow that had grown tired of walls. But there was something about her, something dense and immovable, like a rock buried under shifting sand. You could step on her without seeing her, but you would feel the damage. She sat alone in the far left corner of the cafeteria every day, back to the wall, tray in front of her untouched. She didn't eat much. She didn't talk much. But her eyes were always scanning, slow, sharp, clinical. She wasn't watching people the way a predator does, with appetite. She was watching the way a surgeon might, measuring, predicting, waiting to cut. No one sat beside her. I didn't know the hierarchy then. I didn't understand the rules. I thought if you kept your head down, if you were polite, if you didn't make waves, you could drift through, like a leaf on the surface of a current too strong to fight. But prison doesn't let you drift. It doesn't tolerate silence. It fills it. It demands response. It pokes until you react. And when you do, it judges your reaction with brutal clarity. I had been in general population for 4 days when it happened. I was standing in line, tray in hand, waiting for the slop they called dinner, overcooked beans, and something that might have once been meat, when I felt the push. It wasn't violent, it wasn't even angry. It was casual, the kind of shove that says, move. I turned slightly. It was Lita. She stood behind me, arms folded, eyes steady, not on me, but through me. I stepped aside. I thought that was the end of it. I thought I'd done the right thing. Later, I would learn. You don't move for someone unless they earn it, not unless you're claiming a lower rung on the ladder, not unless you're saying, I am beneath you. That was my first mistake. The second came the next morning when I walked into the laundry room and found my uniform shredded, not torn, cut, precisely, across the back and the sleeves, like someone had been bored and had a razor. I reported it. That was my third mistake. By nightfall, they knew. Lita knew. She didn't come at me with fists. That wasn't her style. She came with silence, a silence that spread around me like mold, dark and suffocating. Women who had nodded to me stopped meeting my eyes. My bunkmate stopped speaking to me. When I walked through the corridor, conversations stalled. I became the pause between words. I became the lesson. The next time I saw her, she was seated on the rec yard bench, arms stretched along the backrest like a throne. I passed her slowly. I could feel her eyes like pins in my spine. I didn't look. I didn't speak. But I felt the tension coil in my shoulders like wire. She didn't hit me. She didn't have to. Others did. It started small. A shove in the showers, a spilled cup on my bed, a stolen bar of soap. Then it escalated. A tray knocked from my hands, a booted foot against my shin as I bent to pick it up. They didn't scream. They didn't yell. It wasn't about rage. It was about message. I stopped sleeping fully. I lay with my eyes half open, my ears tuned to every shift in the hallway. I kept my back to the wall. I learned the sounds of shoes on concrete, the difference between a guard's steps and an inmate's. I learned that safety was a negotiation, not a right. And all the while, Leda watched. She didn't smile, she didn't nod, she didn't give orders, but everyone understood. It was her game, her board. We were just pieces. I tried to talk to the counselor. She was kind in that bureaucratic way, her voice laced with practiced empathy and professional distance. She told me to document the incidents. She told me to try de-escalation. She told me things I used to teach to my own students: conflict resolution, emotional awareness, grounding techniques. None of that applied here. There were no essays to write, no apologies to exchange, no classroom decorum. There was only hierarchy and survival. One evening, as I scrubbed metal trays in the back kitchen, I felt someone step behind me. Close, too close. My fingers froze in the suds. My breath caught, and then a whisper, low and unhurried, slid into my ear like smoke. "Forget who you were." I turned, but no one was there. It didn't matter. I knew the voice. Lita. She didn't need to say more. That night, I sat on the floor of the shower, letting the water pelt my back, and I thought about what it meant to forget, to erase, to shed the layers of myself that had once made me soft, reasonable, open, to unlearn the language of diplomacy and learn the grammar of grit. Something shifted in me then, not all at once, but deeply. I began to observe, not as prey, but as student. I watched how the women walked, how they negotiated space. I noted the way they used silence as power, how they made eye contact like a blade and not a bridge. I started mimicking small things: posture, cadence, tempo. I stopped saying sorry for everything. I stopped thanking the guards. I stopped asking permission. I ate slower. I slept with one arm under my pillow. I found corners to lean into, dark spots in the yard where shadows pooled and eyes couldn't follow. And through it all, Leda watched. She still didn't speak to me again. She didn't have to. She saw the change. She had planted the seed. And I was growing, crooked, hard, in a patch of soil that killed everything too gentle. Her name was Lita, and she had nothing left to lose. But I did, so I learned how to lose less. And in doing so, I began to lose myself. The first time someone hit me, I didn't even see her face. It happened in the showers, where steam clung to the air like a veil and the pipes howled above us like ghosts. I had just turned my back to rinse the cheap soap from my arms when the fist landed. hard, fast, no words, just pain. The metal wall caught my shoulder as I stumbled, and the water washed the taste of blood across my lips before I understood what had happened. There was no scream, no scuffle, just a sharp motion and silence. By the time I turned around, she was already walking away, a towel over her shoulder, her spine straight, like she had just completed a task. No one looked at me. No one offered help. That was the rule. See nothing, say nothing, feel nothing. I crouched under the water until it ran cold, my knees pressed to the tile, trembling not just from pain, but from the knowledge that this was only the beginning. And I was right. The bruises came in all colors: blue around the ribs, yellow near the elbow, deep purple in the spot behind my knee that throbbed when I tried to sleep. At first, I tried to hide them, pulling my sleeves down, sitting stiff to avoid questions. But no one asked. No one cared. The staff noticed, of course. They always notice. But the reports are only written if someone screams loud enough. I never did. Pain became a language. It taught me when to speak and when to disappear. It taught me the map of my own body, where the strikes landed, and how to shift just enough to absorb the impact. It taught me that the idea of fairness was laughable in a place built on silence and power. Eventually, I learned how to move differently. I held my shoulders wider. I lowered my voice. I looked people in the eye just long enough to suggest I wasn't prey, but not long enough to provoke. I stopped flinching. That was the key. You can bleed, but you cannot flinch. My hands changed. They grew calluses I hadn't earned through labor, but through tension. My nails were cut short, not for neatness, but so I wouldn't scratch my own skin in my sleep. I started clenching my jaw so tightly at night that my molars ached in the morning. I didn't cry, not in front of anyone. Not because I was brave, but because tears were a kind of confession. And I had nothing left to confess. I memorized the patterns, the way the hall grew quiet before someone was targeted, the way footsteps changed when someone was following you versus when they were just passing by. I knew the click of a boot heel that meant a guard was near, and the softer scuff of rubber soles that meant danger came from your own kind. One night, as I walked back from kitchen duty, I heard the footsteps behind me speed up. I turned just in time to catch the shove, but not the elbow that followed. It split my lip. I stumbled into the wall. The woman kept walking, didn't even glance back. I wiped the blood with my sleeve and kept moving. No one said a word. No one ever did. The blows stopped feeling like attacks. They began to feel more like checkpoints, moments when the prison tested you, asked, "Are you still soft? Do you still think this is a mistake? Do you still think you belong to the world outside?" At some point, I stopped answering. My dreams changed, too. In the early days, I used to dream of my old life, bookshelves and wooden floors and soft voices across candlelit dinners. But those dreams faded. My mind began to fill instead with shadows. I dreamed of fists and steel and running through hallways that never ended. I'd wake up gasping, fingers curled into the sheet like I was trying to climb out of the mattress. And when the lights flicked on for morning count, I would rise like the rest, spine stiff, mouth dry, and pretend the night had given me rest. I developed routines. Routines were safety. I ate slowly. I cleaned my space 3 times a day, even if it didn't need it. I folded my clothes like armor. I watched faces. I cataloged names. I listened to who got respect and who didn't. I learned who to nod to in the yard and who to avoid in the showers. I stopped reading. I couldn't concentrate. The pages blurred and the words felt false. Fiction felt indulgent, poetry ridiculous. Nothing in the books could prepare me for the logic of this world. Metaphors don't protect you from a punch in the ribs. Instead, I began to write in my head lists, warnings, short sentences, all in present tense. She walks with her left foot heavier than her right. Don't use the third stall. The guard in C block looks away at 4:17 p.m. Don't trust women who smile too quickly. Breathe through your nose when the panic hits. The panic came less often, not because the fear disappeared, but because I learned to keep it locked behind my teeth. One morning, I stood in line for breakfast, and the woman behind me coughed without covering her mouth. Without thinking, I turned and snapped at her. Just one word, sharp and low. The women nearby went quiet. She blinked at me. I held her gaze. She stepped back. That was the first time I realized something inside me had shifted. Not broken, not shattered. Shifted. Like a joint popping into place after being dislocated for too long. That day, no one touched me. That night, I slept without waking. The blows didn't stop, but something in me had changed the way I received them. I no longer asked why. I no longer imagined they'd stop. I simply accepted them, absorbed them, and moved on. The pain was no longer a message, it was a rhythm, and I was learning how to dance. There was a time when I greeted the world with outstretched hands, a gesture that once meant peace, trust, decency. I remember the feel of another's palm in mine, warm, dry, human. I used to look people in the eye, nod gently, offer my hand like a key to a shared language. That habit died quietly, like most soft things do in places built to extinguish them. In prison, the hand you extend is the hand you risk losing. It started subtly. I would reach out instinctively and watch how the gesture floated in dead air. No response, or worse, a slow, assessing look that sliced through skin and read too much into what was meant to be nothing. Everything meant something here, even silence, especially silence. There was a moment, brief, brutal, when I still tried. I remember sitting on a bench near the commissary, my hands resting on my knees, one palm up. An older woman with thin lips and ash-colored hair passed by and glanced at it. Not at me, at my hand. I saw the sneer tug the corner of her mouth. That night, my soap went missing. My blanket had slits in it. My toothbrush was found in the toilet. No one said anything. They didn't have to. My hand had spoken too loudly. After that, I started curling them in. Not just my fingers, but everything inside me. I folded myself inward like paper, creased and hidden, neat and blank. I kept my hands close, elbows tight. I trained myself to greet others with nothing but stillness, not fear, not invitation, stillness. There was safety in becoming unreadable. My body became a script written in stone. I moved economically, sat with my back to the wall, ate with one hand curled loosely in my lap. I watched those who reached first. The new ones always did. The ones who still believed they could change the temperature of this place with kindness. I pitied them at first. Then I feared for them. They always learned, but never in time. One girl, Lena, I think, had a face like a question mark, soft, always asking. She tried to shake hands with everyone on her block during her first week. By the second, she stopped coming out of her cell. By the third, she was transferred to medical. I never saw her again. Her hands had told too much. I began to notice hands everywhere. The woman with jagged knuckles who broke fingers for warnings. The one who braided hair with the tenderness of a mother but watched fights with cold fascination. The guards whose hands hovered near belts, keys, cuffs. Hands could build you or destroy you. I decided mine would do neither. They became instruments, nothing more. I used them to clean, to fold, to write. I began keeping a small journal under my mattress, smuggled in pieces, lines of thought scratched in pencil on the backs of forms, margins of forgotten books. I wrote with my left hand sometimes, just to keep the right one sharp, just in case. There was a night when I sat on my bunk, watching the moonlight stretch across the floor. My hands were in my lap, motionless. I studied them like foreign creatures. The blue veins beneath the skin, the calluses forming on the pads, the way the knuckles had thickened, hardened, as if bone had crept closer to the surface. They looked like my mother's hands once did, worn from use, etched by years. But these had a different story to tell. I imagined for a moment what it would be like to reach out again, to place my hand in someone else's without expectation or fear. But the thought made my stomach twist. Not from longing, but from danger. It was safer to keep them to myself. There were no handshakes in this world, only grips, strikes, restraints, and I wanted none of those. Even kindness felt weaponized. Once, during work duty, I accidentally brushed the shoulder of the woman next to me. She flinched. I apologized with a glance, but she wouldn't meet my eyes. The space between us widened. The rest of the shift passed in silence. She avoided me after that. Touch had consequences, so I stopped offering anything. Not hands, not words, not comfort. My body became a perimeter. I learned to nod without tilting my head, to acknowledge without invitation, to exist without edges that could be touched. It wasn't just protection, it was identity. This was who I had become, a woman without open palms. A woman who understood that vulnerability wasn't beautiful here. It was a scent that predators chased. The day I truly understood the change was during a lockdown. Tensions were high, everyone on edge. We were herded into cells like livestock, the doors slamming shut with finality. My bunkmate sat across from me, rubbing her temples, clearly unraveling. She whispered something, maybe a prayer, maybe nothing. In another life, I would have reached out. I would have taken her hand. Instead, I turned away. Not out of cruelty, not even indifference, but out of survival. I no longer trusted the meaning of that gesture. Hands lied, mine most of all. I remembered when they used to cradle my daughter's head, tie my husband's tie, brush the crumbs from his sweater. They used to write checks, arrange flowers, type emails with polite closings. They used to speak a language of peace. Now they remained quiet. I watched them every night, wondering if they'd remember how to be soft again, wondering if, once I got out, I'd be able to hold someone without flinching, without calculating angles, without thinking, is this a trick? Is this safe? Even in dreams, I hesitated to touch. And when I woke, fists clenched under the pillow, I knew the answer. My hands were no longer mine. They belonged to the woman I had to become, and she didn't offer hers to anyone. When the gate slid open with its familiar groan, it felt more like a test than a release. There was no music, no speech, no bright sun waiting to greet me, just the cold wind brushing against my face like an unfamiliar hand and the crunch of gravel beneath shoes that didn't fit quite right. The clothes they gave me were stiff, like something from someone else's past. A gray sweatshirt 2 sizes too big, pants that sagged at the waist, a plastic bag with my belongings, or what they said were mine, a toothbrush, a comb, a folded piece of paper with an address I didn't recognize, a bus voucher, a list of numbers no longer connected to any voice I wanted to hear. I stood outside the gates for a long while, unsure whether to take a step forward or backward. The guard behind the glass didn't look up again. The world had already forgotten me, and in that moment I wasn't sure I remembered how to be in it. Freedom was not a ribbon-cutting moment. It was a cliff, and I was supposed to jump. I took my first step onto the sidewalk like it might collapse beneath me. Cars rushed by in the distance, their speed almost frightening. I hadn't heard traffic like that in years. I forgot how loud the world could be when no one was regulating its volume. I clutched the bag close to my side and started walking, not toward any destination, just away from the fence. It buzzed behind me, electric and eternal, like a memory that doesn't die just because you stopped looking at it. I didn't know how to cross streets anymore. The light changed, and I hesitated, waiting for some invisible signal, some green arrow in my mind to grant permission. When I finally moved, people passed me with speed and ease, eyes glued to their phones, their heads buried in headphones. I felt like a ghost in the land of the living. No one noticed me. No one slowed down. And maybe that was worse than prison. In there, at least, you were seen. You were accounted for, monitored, named. Out here, I was no one. Just a woman in old sneakers, stepping too cautiously, blinking too often, smelling of something that clung to skin long after bars were gone. I found the bus station and sat on the bench like I was still waiting for count to be called. The schedule confused me. There were too many lines, too many places to go. I had spent years surviving with the knowledge of 100 feet of hallway and a single outdoor yard. Now the world was endless, and I had no idea where to begin. The woman at the counter didn't smile when I approached. She didn't ask where I was coming from. Maybe she knew. Maybe she didn't care. Either way, she handed me the ticket like it was nothing, like I was just another body trying to get from one nowhere to another. On the bus, I sat by the window and watched trees whip past, like pages of a story I hadn't read. I didn't know how to look at them anymore. Beauty used to mean something. It used to be a pause, a breath. Now it was foreign, dangerous. I wasn't sure if I deserved it or if it would devour me the moment I reached out. The seat beside me stayed empty. I was grateful. When I arrived at the address, an old halfway house on the edge of town, I didn't knock right away. I stood at the steps, staring at the chipped paint on the door, the flower pot with dead stems, the mailbox rusted shut. The air smelled like burnt toast and tired dreams. I finally went in. Inside, there were women like me, or maybe not like me at all. Some wore their freedom like a badge, loud and restless. Others barely spoke, their eyes scanning corners like they were still watching for shanks. I recognized the look, the one that said, "I'll sleep with my shoes on, I'll eat with my back to the wall, I'll trust no one until proven otherwise." We nodded to each other in passing. That was all. No one asked what I did. No one offered to help unpack. There was nothing to unpack anyway. Just that bag, that paper, that ticket stub I still carried like proof I had crossed a border no one else could see. My room had a bed, a small table, and a barred window, even though the bars were decorative now. I stared at them for a long time, wondering if they were meant to comfort me. Maybe someone thought it would ease the transition. Maybe someone didn't know the damage that came from sleeping behind steel for years. I didn't sleep the first night. Too much quiet, too much space, too much freedom I hadn't earned. The next morning, I didn't know what to wear. The clothes donated by churches didn't feel right. Too bright, too soft. I picked a plain shirt and pants that hung stiff against my hips. I stared at my reflection in the bathroom mirror and didn't recognize her. She stood too straight. Her eyes were too flat. Her mouth held no curve. I raised a hand and touched the glass, half expecting it to ripple. At breakfast, a woman poured coffee and asked if I wanted sugar. I nodded. She poured it anyway. I didn't say thank you. Not because I wasn't grateful, but because I wasn't ready to speak. My voice felt locked behind years of silence, of regulation, of permission. I needed to remember how to use it again. They gave us pamphlets, job training, counseling, things to help us re-enter society. I read them like recipes written in a foreign tongue. How to budget, how to apply for work, how to smile at strangers without flinching. No one gave a manual for grief, for guilt, for waking up to a sky you didn't trust. I carried that grief like a second skin. It made everything heavier, even sunlight. Sometimes in the hallway, I caught the scent of someone's perfume, sweet, sharp, familiar, and felt my knees weaken. It reminded me of home, of bookshelves and casseroles, and someone humming in the kitchen. But I didn't let myself cry. That was rule one now. No tears in freedom. Because freedom was not soft. Freedom was a battlefield with invisible mines. One wrong step, and everything would detonate. A missed appointment, a late bus, a wrong tone. All of it could send you back. Back to where things made more sense, where pain had rules. Out here, everything looked normal, but felt false. I smiled at a cashier once, and she smiled back. But I knew the difference. Mine was rehearsed. Hers was real. That night, I lay on the bed and stared at the ceiling, wondering if I was broken or just unfinished, if freedom was supposed to feel this lonely, if I would ever feel human again without someone telling me when to sleep, when to eat, when to breathe. No one told me how hard it would be to live. They just opened the gate and assumed I'd know. But there are no instructions for returning to a world that stopped being yours. There is only the silence and the slow rebuilding of a self you don't fully remember. I was standing in line at the grocery store when I realized I had scanned the entire room 3 times in under a minute. I had taken note of the exits, memorized the positions of the cameras, clocked the movements of the cashier, and calculated how long it would take to duck behind the aisle if something went wrong. The habit was unconscious, automatic. My body moved faster than thought. My breathing stayed shallow, my spine straight, eyes alert, not wide with fear, just prepared. I wasn't scared, I was ready. There was a difference, and it lived in the marrow of me now. Even with the prison gates behind me, even with the uniform off, even with a name tag on my chest that said Ashley Assistant Baker, I didn't feel out. I felt paused, like the movie had stopped but the music still played in my head. There were moments, like that one in the grocery store, when I would freeze with a carton of milk in hand, realizing I was scanning civilians like they were threats. Watching a mother pick up a box of cereal, a boy tapping his foot to music only he could hear, and thinking, not with cruelty, but with instinct, how fast I could take control if the lights went out. It wasn't just in public. At home, if I heard a door creak at night, I reached for the side of the bed where no weapon waited. If someone knocked, I stood to the side before opening. I never turned my back in the shower, never put both earbuds in, never left food unattended, even when the food was just toast. There were rituals that had once been survival. Now they were just mine. I folded my clothes into sharp rectangles, stacked them with corners aligned. I timed my showers to 5 minutes or less. I never left dishes in the sink. I didn't know why. No one was grading me anymore. No one was watching. But it felt wrong to let anything slip. Cleanliness had been safety. Order had been protection. Distraction was danger. I still didn't sleep without shoes nearby. I didn't like beds too soft, and I never ever let my hands rest on the table, because where I came from, idle hands invited questions. Or worse, some people asked why I was always so quiet. I said I liked the silence. They didn't know the silence had once been the only safe thing I could cling to. They didn't know what it was like to keep your breath small and your footsteps smaller. Sometimes I would catch myself counting steps, not for any reason, just out of muscle memory. 12 to the corner, 9 to the exit, 18 from my locker to the oven at the bakery. I never lost the numbers. They were maps burned into me like tattoos under the skin. Maps that had once kept me from bleeding. I worked with flour-covered hands and watched people smile too easily, laugh too loudly. I watched them touch each other without flinching. They trusted the world, trusted time, trusted their luck. I didn't. I trusted gravity, steel. The weight of knowing the worst thing that could happen had already happened. I had become someone else in order to survive. But no one told me how to unbecome her. No one warned me that the transformation wouldn't have an end date. People assumed you could just go back, that you stepped out of the fire and walked into daylight and left the smoke behind. But I was still smoke, still made of ash, still carrying the heat in my chest, where it curled up and smoldered in quiet hours. I tried once to go on a date. It was suggested, gently, like a prescription, like someone thought it would be good for me. I wore the dress I bought secondhand, the one with flowers, trying to remember softness. The man talked a lot. He talked about baseball and his sister's dog and a movie he liked. He asked me what I did for fun. I didn't know how to answer. I stared at my plate and tried to chew slow, like the women I used to watch on TV, back when I thought people like that were real. I watched his hands, measured his voice, studied his eyes for signs of sudden temperature change. When he reached across the table, I didn't flinch. I froze, which was worse. Afterward, I went home and washed the dress and hung it back in the closet. It hung there like an apology, like something waiting for a woman who no longer existed. I didn't wear it again. There were days I walked past a mirror and didn't recognize my own body. My shoulders were wider than I remembered, my stance more grounded. There was a calmness to my posture that frightened me, a stillness like a coiled rope. I had learned to hold myself like someone no one should mess with, and I didn't know how to let that go. Sometimes, in line at the bakery, children would stare at me. They weren't afraid. They were just curious. But I didn't smile back. Not because I didn't want to, but because I didn't know what my face looked like when it smiled anymore. I hadn't practiced it enough. It felt like trying to speak a language I used to know. And even when I did smile, it never reached the eyes. That's what people said about me. She's kind but cold, smart but distant, quiet but intense, as if those were bad things, as if they wanted me to be loud and open and blooming like someone untouched by fire. But fire had made me, and what it burns, it claims. There were mornings I still woke up thinking I had missed count. Nights I lay awake because the silence felt too quiet. I didn't believe in safe. I didn't believe in rest. I believed in endurance. I believed in checking the locks twice. I kept a knife in my kitchen drawer, not to use, just to know it was there. I kept a flashlight by my bed. I kept a bag packed with 2 changes of clothes, just in case. Because when you live in a world where things can vanish overnight, you never unpack too deeply. You never let your heart settle fully into anything. I wasn't angry. I wasn't bitter. I just didn't know how to be soft again. The woman I had been, the one with the trembling hands and hopeful heart, was buried under layers of necessary hardness. And though I tried, I couldn't dig her out without also unearthing everything else. There was no off switch. There was only maintenance. And maybe that was the hardest truth of all. Survival was not a phase. It was a permanent state of awareness, a recalibration of self, a quiet vigilance that never asked permission and never waited to be invited. It lived in me now, and I had to learn not to hate it, only to live with it.